It's really a thrill to introduce you to two scholar artists whose work I so admire, Amer Kanngieser and Zoe Todd. Before I do that, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional homelands of the Wabanaki Confederacy, the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Mi'kmaq peoples, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. Long before my family came to spend the summer in what European colonists called the Fox Islands, members of the Penobscot Nation were here. I respect the traditional values of the Penobscot and the Confederacy and affirm their inherent sovereignty in this territory. I support their efforts for land and water protection and restoration, and for cultural healing and recovery. Please pause in remembrance of the tribes of the Wabanaki Confederacy, whose lives and land were taken through genocidal strategies of colonial settlement of the land. I offer my respect to elders, both past and present, and I'm committed to the ongoing work of decolonization in Maine and beyond, including in the Delaware River, Valley, and Bay, in the mid-Atlantic region of North America, where the Pennsylvania is located on the traditional homeland of the Lenni Lenape people in Lenapehoking. During the colonial era and early federal period, many Lenape were removed west and north, but some also remain. I take this moment to acknowledge the Lenni Lenape as the original people of this land, as well as their continuing relationship with their territory. In this acknowledgement of the continued presence of Lenape people in their homeland, I echo the words of the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape Nation, who affirm the aspiration of the great Lenape chief Tamanend that there be harmony between the Indigenous people of this land and the descendants of the immigrants to this land, as long as the rivers and creeks flow and the sun, moon, and stars shine. When my ASLE co-president, Laura Barbas-Roden, and I began dreaming about who we hoped might offer keynotes at this year's virtual conference on the topic of emergency, we immediately thought of anthropologist, writer, and fish philosopher Zoe Todd. Like many others, and maybe you, I first encountered Todd's written work in a blog post that went viral and was then published as the 2016 article entitled An Indigenous Feminist Take on the Ontological Turn. Ontology is just another word for colonialism. It was an important provocation for me, good to think and to teach with, and my students thought so too. That article and the conversations it engendered were my gateway into Todd's work and her many articles. I also often reread her Tenderness Manifesto, a poem that reminds us that tender is a simultaneous condition for connection and a symptom of too much connection. And it continues to ask, how do we make space for all of this in a world so bent on certainty? How do we tend to tenderness? Zoe Todd also provided Laura and me the portal to the work of Amer Kanngieser, sound artist and political geographer. Amer's work, in the words of the catalog for the Sonia podcast, produced by the Museum of Contemporary Art, is located in the coordinates between space and sound. Merging of disciplines that seems completely normal to them tends to be more perplexed, compartmentalized world of science, academia, artistic practice. Writing for and between academic and non-academic audiences, as well as recording, theorizing, and making audio work, Amer Kanngieser is a guide to practices of decolonial listening and attunement. With Zoe Todd, Kanngieser explores what it means to listen with tenderness. Kanngieser and Todd, as you have heard in their recorded keynote address on environmental kin studies, collaborate on work that considers how academically situated work can be brought into better relation with the worlds it has too long studied and exploited at an arm's length taking possession of what seemed valuable. As Kanngieser and Todd say in their keynote for ASLE, they are concerned with and for global ecological hotspots whose local specific experiences of devastation are erased by the colonial academy and its severing of thought from place. Their keynote offers a definition of environmental humanities as, and I'm quoting, an eclectic and interdisciplinary pursuit of how nature has been divided from culture, how culture has been cleaved from the material world, and how thought has been separated from place. Their own work, restoring thought into place, is at once methodologically innovative and rigorous, and among the very best in the emergent field of environmental humanities. As their ASLE keynote concludes, these practices of restoring through seeking consent, of being in good relation, of listening to land, are all practices that non-Indigenous scholars are invited to attend to, whether in proximity or over vast distances. Their work is marked by collaboration, reciprocity, and generosity. I could not be more grateful for their generosity in being with us today. Please join me in welcoming and thanking Amer, Kanngieser, and Zoe Todd for activating these digital and physical spaces with us. And just a note on housekeeping, before I turn the mic over to them and to you in the audience, for audience members, please remember to keep your mics muted until you are called on. If you'd like to ask a question, please just indicate that briefly in the chat. You can just drop a keynote or two about, a keyword or two about what your question might be. There's no need to write out the whole question. I'll do my best to call on you in the order I see your question in the chat. And I'll try also to group questions around coherent topics. When you're called on, simply unmic and do your best to keep your question concise and accessible. We'll end this live Q&A session promptly at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And now over to you, Amer and Zoe. I'm going to start you off with a question, as I promised in our email correspondence. It's a very broad question, and please take it as you prefer. Respond in any way that seems productive to you. So could you describe the process of your collaboration? And I'm wondering in particular, how have you merged individual practices of attuning, of listening, of recording, of writing and speaking? How have you merged them or otherwise thought them together to co-develop practices that restore kinship? Would you say that your work is propelled by a collaborative ethic? And if so, what might that ethic be?
Well, first, thank you for that very generous introduction and for really attending to our work. And we're all so busy and it's a pandemic, so the time you've taken to listen to our work but also engage with it beyond the keynote is just really deeply appreciated. I don't know, I could start if you want, or so I distinctly remember meeting Amer actually after I wrote that viral blog post, and I was put in touch with a colleague named Angela Last, who had co-written a piece on the Anthropocene and geology and geography with Angela. And then we kind of just started a correspondence from there. But it was really, I guess, in the last couple of years that we came to find interconnections in our projects. And we finally met in person in 2019 at the American Geographers Association conference in DC. And then Amer was just incredibly present while I had COVID last year. And I think that's really what solidified some of our work, was just that sort of like, well, a co-emergence of survival across continents. And now we are very firmly collaborators and co-authors and co-thinkers with a very interconnected personal friendship, but also professional relationship. And now we give lots of our talks together now, and I can't imagine really doing otherwise. So yeah, so that's how Amer came into my orbit, but you may have things to add.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think our collaboration and the work that we do is very much underpinned by a shared way of being in the world and a shared way of imagining what kind of worlds we'd like to see. I mean, I think what's so crucial to the work that we do is, I mean, it's relationality. It's the way that we relate to each other, the way that we relate to the people that we work with, and the way that we relate to, how we might imagine other possibilities. So I think, yeah, it's impossible. Well, at least I feel, I'm imagining it's the same for Zoe. It's impossible for us to do the kind of work that we do without being extremely attentive to how we relate to each other, how we respect each other and take care of each other, because it's an ethos that is very much personal and professional, and it translates across everything that we do together.
Thank you so much for that insight into your process and your practices. That was really moving to hear. Hoping that you're feeling better, Zoe, amidst this pandemic. We're really eager to take questions from the audience, and really happy to hear from you. So we'll give you a moment to think and drop your potential question into the chat. While we're waiting for the chat to light up, which I'm sure, I'm wondering if you might speak a little bit about, I read a view, I think, of some sound installations you had made, Amer, about your, I don't know if it was the reviewer describing your efforts or your own words, it was not clear, but about really like resisting the corset of academic work or academic habitude and habits. And that resonated so strongly with me. And I just thought, what a really great way to think about this corset that we're in. And I'm curious about, for both of you, what specific strategies, I know from conversations I've been in this conference over the last 10 days or so, that there are many people who are thinking about ways of loosening the corset or slipping it off, or otherwise opening the academy to more, let's say, liberatory expressions, both for one's own work and inviting others into this space to decolonize it more meaningfully. I wondered if you might offer any thoughts on strategy in that direction.
Yeah, thanks. Those were not my words. It must have been the reviewers' words. But yeah, I mean, for me personally, I'm very interdisciplinary. I'm a political and human geographer as well as a sound artist, which is a fairly left of field combination. I've realized over many, many years, there's not many people working in that particular space. And I think, at least where I've worked in the UK and in Australia, working interdisciplinarily is extremely hard. There's a lot of conversation around interdisciplinarity, and there seems to be a desire for interdisciplinarity, but realistically, when it comes down to it, it's an uncomfortable position to inhabit in terms of the pragmatics of neoliberal academic job markets and, metrics and requirements for funding and things like that. So, I think I don't really have much to say in terms of strategy, because to be honest with you, I'm also a disabled scholar, and, I don't have a permanent position. So the way that I work is quite precarious. And I would say that for me personally, a lot of sacrifices come with the way that I work. And there's sacrifices that I'm very willing to make, because for me, my values and ethics are more important than academia. So, but I would certainly say that, there's a lot of conversation, of very pragmatic and material conversation that needs to be had about what doing this kind of work really entails and what is needed to support scholars, particularly minoritized scholars, racialized scholars, you know, disabled scholars, trans scholars, scholars that come from economically impoverished backgrounds, you know, of what it actually takes to do this kind of work. Because for the most part, in my experience, there's a lot of lip service to it, but very little material and institutional support to be moving outside of those kind of very conventional academic ways of doing things.
I haven't sort of, as someone who has a permanent job and tenure, my past lives were studying biology. I thought I was going to be a medical doctor, then moving through to rural sociology and anthropology. But my previous lives were as nonprofit directors and community organizing, and actually working for the left-leaning opposition briefly in Alberta as well, which is a very conservative place. And a dear friend who works for a very elite university has said that their job is to liberate the ill-gotten funds of the institution. And I've taken that to heart. I'm not necessarily in an elite institution in Canada, but it's still one in the capital, which we jokingly, but also quite seriously call the Death Star. And so I take it quite seriously that I have a responsibility as someone who's achieved now a like firmly petty bourgeois position within these institutions, that I have to help those funds flow back to the people who are using them. And with my background in project management and nonprofit work, like it's also about being really strategic and organized in how those projects happen, so that nothing is wasted on people with $200,000 a year salaries, but instead is actually flowing to the people who need that money. And I've worked on some projects by people who didn't have that background in organizing, and I've just seen the way that they waste money, and it really, that drives me very strongly, that when I'm helping folks to apply for grants, like we're very strategic about like, okay, we have to hire people from the community, there has to be some sort of like long-term benefit. We use our own funds to travel so that community members get that travel funding, and it's stuff like that. So I know that's like not a very romantic response, but for me, it's a very material response, that like being really strategic about how we use the resources and getting them out of the spaces. And then my second kind of answer is just that interdisciplinarity, working through interdisciplinarity, also part of it is I really feel a need to push back against the ego and competition of the institutions, like Western institutions, colonial institutions, and that there has to be a measure of like willingness to move beyond that. And I don't know how to like really say it other than like it's about listening, and it's about listening and humility, and because it's really easy to sort of forget that, because the institutions sort of pump you up and you're supposed to sort of like make yourself out to be the only person doing this thing so that you can get the funding, but actually we're so deeply interdependent. And so I push back on that. But I'm also seen as a troublemaker at my institution, so that it comes with costs. And you may become very unpopular amongst people who are very invested in keeping those systems going.
Thank you both for those answers. You're mentioning, Zoe, of listening leads directly into questions we have coming in the chat. Natalie, Joelle, would you unmute and ask your question, please?
Thanks so much, Bethany, and to both of you for a really wonderful keynote, which I particularly appreciate the positionality of as a multiple disabled doctoral candidate. My question is around deep listening and non-violence, and I was wondering, to what extent have you found deep listening to be intimately connected with an ethic of non-violence, or can deep listening be used to justify violence?
Thank you. That's a fantastic question. And yeah, much solidarity to you as having been a former disabled PhD student. It's a very hard world to navigate with multiple disabilities. Deep listening is really interesting. There are so, I mean, as Zoe said before, you know, and as we say in our talk as well, like the work that we're doing has been done for millennia, you know, like these ideas around listening and the kind of dispositions around listening, nothing we're saying is new, you know, it's all there, and it's, you know, really instrumental to so many different cultures and the ways that people live in their environments and, you know, interact with their environments and interact socially as well. You know, there are a lot of philosophies around deep listening. And I think it's a really interesting question, because I think particularly the way that deep listening has been taken up, you know, over the last couple of decades within sound studies, a lot of it, trying to figure out a way to say this elegantly. Firstly, a lot of the theories, particularly the white academic theories around deep listening, draw from Indigenous cosmologies and ideas and appropriate from that and never reference it and never cite it and never really talk about where it kind of comes from. You know, there's a lot of deep listening work around composition, which I think is really, really interesting. Sound studies and music studies is really, really interesting and really illuminating. And at the basis of all of that appropriated work is a foundation of doing no harm and a commitment to nonviolence. But also in the way that it's come about and the way that it's used, it itself does a lot of harm and erases a lot of people that it draws from. So, you know, it's kind of a bit of a double-edged sword. I think to talk about deep listening as a practice, we have to talk about where the ideas of deep listening that we're using come from and the way that they engage with the world themselves. So, you know, I think, yes, deep listening can be mobilized towards nonviolence, but deep listening itself can also be a very violent process as well, particularly as well in terms of the ways that, you know, white academic scholars listen and what they demand of the things that they're listening to, the demand for transparency, the demand for listening itself, listening where it's not yours to listen to, listening to where you're not wanted. And then also the violence that comes with interpretation, of making sense what you're listening to and analyzing it, and then creating a narrative about the world that is, you know, deeply stuck, you know, and deeply singular as well. So, yeah.
Thank you
so much. Robin Visser, would you like to unmute, please?
Hi, happy to do so. I really appreciated, try to turn this on. I really appreciated the keynote, and I'm in the field of literary studies, but do a lot of field research to understand the context of the authors. I write about Indigenous writers from Sinophone writers, mostly from different areas in China. And I was really taken with your examples of, you know, when you're not able to get answers. For example, you're there, you're listening, and you come away with, I put in quotes, nothing in the chat, but I know that's, you know, I understand that's not nothing, but I just love to hear more about how you work against the pressures of the academy to push for answers, basically, and in practical terms when you're doing your research. Thank you.
I mean, so Amer has amazing examples from their fields recordings and of sort of like the land itself refusing to provide answers, or, you know, answers in the way that we are expecting them. You know, as someone who trained in British anthropology, there really is a pressure to know and to claim and to collect. But, you know, I'm really grateful that the doctoral work that I did, there were a lot of things that just weren't for me to know. And knowledge keepers that I worked with, you know, they would sort of look me in the eye and say, like, I'm going to explain something to you, but this is not for you to know. And like, which was, you know, like, this is not for you to record. This, you can know the kind of general context that this exists, but you don't need, the stories aren't for you. And I really appreciated that explicit care in how, you know, interlocutors I was working with could sort of say, like, you know, you're not Inuk, you're not a Nubialawi, like these are not for you. And I try to sort of reaffirm that for students I'm working with. A lot of students in anthropology in Canada are still working with Indigenous communities, like they want to go work with Indigenous communities. And so in teaching ethics and research methodology courses, I sort of just try to sort of say, like, building on what Amer has taught me, that just, and what interlocutors in Polytech taught me, like, it's just some things aren't for us to know. And so actually a student did a really brilliant project kind of taking that into account, where they wanted to work on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And so I sort of gently said, like, that's not really for you to do as a settler. But what they were able to do instead is they created an archive of how the settler institutions engaged the public and solicited them to engage with the inquiry that happened a few years ago. And they created this incredible archive of the bureaucracy and the communication strategy. And so I think that those moments of, like, where things are maybe not explicitly for you, but there's ways that you can, it sounds like you're already doing that. So I don't know, but I think, like, just that, like, to affirm that that not knowing can then create really interesting structural questions. And then, I'm living in lands right now that are not mine. They're not my ancestral lands. And I experience things in the forest where I know that there is something present, but it's not for me to know what it is, just that my responsibility is to respect it and remove myself from that space. If it's communicating to me, it doesn't want me there. I don't need to know the story. I don't need to know exactly what that presence is. And so that's something I'm trying to, like, bring out of my academic work and into my personal work as well. It's just kind of like knowing when to be present and when to remove oneself, which is like the antithesis to the settler ethic, which is to just be present forever. But it's a really good question. I'll let Ami jump in.
Oh, I was just going to say, to add to your extremely comprehensive answer, so I barely have anything to say anyway, to add to that, I think also, what's always kind of pointed out is that, like, not knowing is an invitation for a redirection. And I think that it's absolutely, it's absolutely crucial in my work to kind of say, okay, well, what is not knowing telling me here? What is this silence actually telling me here? Because it's telling me a lot of information, where I can put my attention elsewhere. I think the most dangerous thing that happens in academia around this is that there's a tendency to panic. I don't know, so I'm going to start assuming, and I'm going to start making an argument, and I'm going to start building a narrative. And what actually ends up happening is you move away from the thing. You can have a lot of, like, good intentions around how you're ethically going to approach something, but it doesn't work out how you want it because you've overlaid too many expectations on it. And then there's a panic, and it's like, well, I've just got to make it fit. And you start to move away from the thing itself and to move into this kind of, like, abstract, this abstract object that you're then working with. And I think, I see that a lot. Also, I see that a lot with students, like, I've got to make an argument work. We're taught that we have to make an argument. We're taught that we have to know what we're talking about. We have to be assertive. We have to be certain, and I think that's one of the hardest things to undo, is to actually just be with the fact that, okay, this is not yielding what I wanted. This is not yielding what I expected. So what can I learn from what I have instead? And how can I redirect my attention? And how can I ask different questions of this? Maybe my questions are wrong. Maybe I'm just, like, pursuing the wrong direction. And there's absolutely no problem with just redirecting in another way, and doing that constantly. I feel like that's what we do in our work all the time, is that, I think we also said in our talk, like, so much of what we hear, we end up being like, why? What am I going to do with this? What is this? And to just kind of be like, actually, I don't know. And that's fine. And maybe something will reveal itself to us in 3 years' time. And we'll be like, oh my gosh, like, that was what that thing was. But for this moment, at this time, you don't know, and that's okay.
Thank you both. Yeah.
Marika Hecht.
Hello to you both, to all of you here in this little virtual space that we're sharing. My name is Marika. My question is really, I feel like you've answered it. I was so captivated by this notion of letting go of clarity. My background is also in Eurocentric sciences, both my undergrad and master's degrees there, and now I am a learning scientist studying environmental education. And so this is always a challenge with young people who are studying science and science education. They want to know things, they want to discover things, and make their mark. So maybe you could just reflect a little more on this idea of what it means to really sit with a lack of clarity as a practice.
Me, that's a brilliant question. These have all been brilliant questions. This is a very affirming question and answer experience, so thank you all. But for me, the thought that immediately comes to my mind, ironically, I have an immediate answer, which is a sense of softening into relationship. And so that just sort of like allowing the settling, you know, like just like, okay, because I did my undergrad in biology, and I know that like you're supposed to memorize all these, you know, classifications and energy pathways, and yet those are just like one aspect of this like much broader set of things that you know, they're just approximations of things that are going on, and so I'm grateful for my experiences of doing my PhD and making mistakes and having elders and knowledge keepers say like, why are you acting like a white lady? And then being like, oh no. And that created the space of like needing to settle into my relationships and worry less about you know, performing for the academy in a way that's legible to it, but instead coming into relationships that affirm my responsibilities and obligations to other people and places and, you know, existences that populate and story place. And so I think, you know, it's like a lifelong journey. And it's really hard to tell a 19-year-old undergrad, like, this is a lifelong journey. And yes, you're only going to be here for 4 years. But creating that space, I think in the classroom, I try to create space for students to not know. I think I'm trying to do that. I mean, they would be the ones to ask, but I try to sort of say, like, you're all smart. Like, that's a given. So you don't need to prove your smartness. I'm more interested in how you can think through the relationships and how they shape your experiences and how they shape your ongoing responsibilities. So yeah, anyways, that's the answer that comes to mind for me, is just sort of, it's a settling process. and maybe that, you know, it's a deliberate opposition to the forced settlement of the settler colonizer. It's more like the settling of sediments, or you know, when you're in a creek and things are kind of moving into place and reconfiguration. But I'll leave it to Amer to answer some. Yeah.
I mean, I just think, yeah, like, you know, Zoe, you've basically covered it. But I think also, thank you. I think also, you know, just being curious around it as well, like just kind of being like, okay, well, you know, this is what I'm taught, or this is the way that I'm being asked to kind of be, but I can't really, you know, I can't really be that way, or I can't really make sense of what's going on. And to just, again, like just being curious about what it is that you don't know, and why you don't know, and why you might not be able to know. And I think I did an interview the other day with some master's students at UCL, some anthropology master's students, you know, at University College of London. And one of the things that, you know, they were saying was that everything that they're taught is completely opposite to what Zoe and I are saying, you know, and how hard it is to constantly be in this position where you know in yourself that you don't know, and you're being forced into this role as an expert, being taught by other people who are also forced into roles as experts. I mean, I remember my favorite philosophy teacher in undergrad. I'll never forget. It was like second year philosophy or something. It was like, I can't even remember, we were doing like Nietzsche or something. And I remember asking my philosophy teacher, Professor Rosalind Diprose, you know, a question. And she said, you know what, I don't have an answer to that, but I'm going to go away tonight, and next time I see you, we can talk about it more. And I really thought that that was probably one of the most crucial moments for me as a student, to have this like very revered philosopher, you know, saying, feminist philosopher saying, I have no idea, you know, she said it very unashamedly. It was very matter of fact, you know, in class. I just don't know, but I'll get back to you on it, you know. And I think that's really, really important, like to be able to say, whatever discipline you're in, like, I don't really know, but we can figure it out, or, you know, let's be curious about it, or what kind of, you know, what's a different way that we might approach it. And to even just as like, you know, in a pedagogical role, to just kind of give that reassurance that, you know, whatever discipline we're in, this kind of push to expertise is something that is actually very damaging, and is actually false as well, you know, because that's just not anything that academics are supposed to ever admit.
Great. We can hear from Jupong Ling next.
Thank you. My name is Jupong Lin. I'm speaking to you from Nonotuck and Pecumtuck lands. I was so moved by your keynote and the whole idea of environmental kin studies. It's just, I feel like I came to my PhD very late in life after a long career as an artist, and I'm now sort of in the home stretch, but really got hung up with the dissertation proposal. And so this whole Q&A is just so helpful. As an artist in an environmental studies program that's dominated by, you know, Western trained scientists, colonial trained scientists. So anyway, to get to the question, I was finding a lot of resonance between the ways that the two of you talk about the spiritual and sacred relations and you know, the dimensions of kinship, and finding resonance with that and Taoist and Buddhist traditions, and you know, around Taoist and Buddhist practices, I'm super aware of how those Eastern contemplative traditions have been appropriated and secularized and medicalized. And so I guess the question is, I wonder if you have any concerns about the appropriation of, you know, kinship, and yeah, just I'd like to hear you think about appropriation and how to resist it.
That is a fantastic question. And I think, you know, as an Indigenous person working in Canada, it's very live to some of the conversations that are happening today. And so I keep trying to come back to specific relationships that, you know, so the idea of like moving from explicit relationships in place and being attentive to the specific obligations that those entail. So in Canada, like there's a real challenge with sort of an ethnographic reimagining of what Indigenous peoples are. And this has allowed, in fact, even white non-Indigenous peoples to sort of reinvent themselves as Indigenous repeatedly through time, as Phil Deloria and others have explored. And so Kim Tolver puts it really well. She says kin are, because Kim Tolver is Kim Tolver, she said it really off the cuff once at a dinner after a conference, where she said, people need to remember kin is who you sleep with, but it's also who you kill. And I hope I'm giving the right sort of, you know, accurate reflection of that statement, but it stuck with me because I think that, again, sort of a white liberal tradition imagines kinship solely as positive, but there can be like negative reciprocity, and the actions you undertake can do harm if you're in bad relation. And so I think that without being able to speak to Taoist and Buddhist traditions as someone who doesn't practice them and is not in relation to them, but I do think the impression I get is that white liberals have sort of appropriated these concepts without the underlying, you know, negative and positive reciprocity that comes with enacting a specific, you know, like way of knowing and being. And I see that happening in Canada with Indigenous practices. And so Kim has even said she's sort of shifting away from saying kinship to relationship, because kinship still holds that kind of connotation of ethnography and also biology. And so I'm trying to refract kinship still and sort of think through it. So I have a paper that hopefully will come out that sort of talks about how a Western concept of kinship is ancestry without relationship and ancestry without obligation. But for a Métis person like myself, kinship is tied to concepts like kotuin, which is a relationship between all things, and that it's a relationship with obligations. And I don't know if that helps answer your question, but it's a very important one, because this appropriative move, like, I guess it's really, it sounds like, you know, I think it goes beyond, like Aileen Morton Robinson is theorizing in Australia about the white possessive, but it infiltrates so many spaces that people sort of think like, and I've written Twitter threads about how, like I'm moving away from teaching Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, not because it's a good text, but because white people read it and then sort of think like, I'm just going to braid knowledge. And like they aren't doing them like the breaking down of the material relationships that underlie that. And so, yeah, but it's, so that's, I think, something for Amer and I also to consider, like making sure that we're really explicit about, because we don't want to be recreating those possessive moves. And it's precisely those moves that create this danger of the academy reproducing itself through ownership rather than relationship.
I mean, I think that the same thing bears entirely true for ideas around listening. I think that there's so much discourse around listening that has to do with appropriating things from other cultures and particularly around meditative practices and the whole kind of wellness trend and things like that. There's a lot of emphasis around listening and being, just the claim of even I'm listening, I'm attending, I'm paying attention to. And I think one of the things that, is quite important in the work that we do, that Zoe and I do around this specifically to situate ourselves, is that we draw very, very heavily, and at least for me, like almost exclusively on the ideas and philosophies of the people that we are working with. So the ideas of listening that I'm working with come from different Pacific people that I work with who are like, this is what you need to know about how we listen. This is the importance of listening in the way that we live, So I think that's one really important thing, is that our work is trying to be as much as possible very much situated in those collaborative relationships of the people that we're working with. So it doesn't become this amorphous idea of, listening, because I know that a lot of people are talking about listening. A lot of people are very excited about listening. I mean, the other thing that is really important, I think that ties to that for us as well, is that it's towards a very specific goal in a way, or towards a very specific purpose, which is the purpose of reparations and the purpose of liberation and land back. It's not listening for the sake of listening. It's not kinship for the sake of a kind of theoretical exploration. It's a very kind of grounded and material and relational and collaborative idea of self-determination and sovereignty that we're trying to purpose this work towards. So yeah, again, similarly to Zoe, I'm really sorry, I'm not very familiar with Buddhist conceptions around this, but yeah, I mean, I think we do this work very slowly, and we do this work really in relation precisely so that we can understand like where we're situating ourselves and why we're situating ourselves in those ways.
And where we might be going wrong.
Yeah.
Linda Russo.
Hi, and Ame and Zoe, and thank you so much for the marvelous job you did of revealing, and sharing your methodology. And I'm finding it very affirming, and I'm loving this discussion. I mean, I'm feeling love and care, and it feels really good. So I want to thank you for that. So my question is, what role does art making play in your process? And how do you see the art that arises from restoring, working on its audiences or listeners, if you conceive it as such?
So my dad, who lives just 2 doors down now, is an artist. He's a Métis artist who got his BFA from the University of Alberta. And so he taught me sort of the basics of visual expression, but I'm not a trained artist. And, but like, so I don't know, it's like kindergarten. I've been painting watercolors lately, trying to sort of reimagine, because we're in a drought here in BC, like an unprecedented drought, and there's forest fires. And so for me, art from a very early age was just part of like how we explored relationships and self-expression in our household. And I spent a bit of time adjacent to the more like professional art world, observing them, doing my quiet ethnography. And I think that the thing that came through really clearly is that like at least the Western academic professional art world is a lot like science and other Western disciplines, in that it's, you know, it's built on capitalism, exploitation, extraction, and sort of a singular claim to creating things. And for me, art is more about relationship and exploration and curiosity, and like should be allowed to explore joy and grief and all those things, not for the sake of making money. And like, I mean, if you want to make money off your art, please do. Like, I'm not here to say that the only true artist is the impoverished artist, although I've dated more than one middle-class white man who felt that that was the only true expression of art. But for me, like, art is just, it kind of emerges spontaneously in my work. I was trying to find ways to illustrate the fish that people were teaching me about in my doctoral work in the Western Arctic in Canada, and there weren't really images that like the sciences were using that sort of I felt were useful. So I just started drawing my own fish, and people in the community really liked the fish I was drawing. And so I put those in my PhD, and then that morphed into me doing these fish paintings that have kind of become central to my work, but then has morphed into me doing sort of like other environmental explorations, and now animations, and then working with Amer, combining that with their sound art, and like, yeah, I'm not represented by the art world, but being in the academy has allowed me to be sort of adjacent to it, and so it's been interesting to kind of bring that in. So for me, it's just kind of spontaneous and necessary, but it's a tool that I use alongside my archival work, my interviews, my surveys, like any other tool. And I try to encourage students to use art as well, and to just sort of remind people you don't have to be a professional artist, or you don't have to have gone to the top art schools to be playing around with self-expression. I don't know if that helps, but yeah, for me it's joyful, and it's a way of exploring relationships between place and time, and
Yeah, thanks for that question. You know, I am a practicing artist as well as academic, and you know, I did not grow up in an artistic environment. In fact, my parents would not allow me to go to art school because they said I had to get a real job and had to do a real degree. So I never actually was, I'm not professionally trained, I'm self-taught. And it actually took a long time for me to bring my artistic work into my academic work, because, you know, I was very much kind of pushed along. Well, geography isn't a very artistic discipline, so I'll just sort of put it like that, you know. And it actually took a really long time, and it took someone else kind of saying, you live these two lives simultaneously. It seems very exhausting. It's probably a good idea to merge them. You know, it might fare you well. And so I did start merging them. And, you know, I think particularly for the work that I do and the work that Zoe and I do, artistic expression is actually quite crucial, you know, in the work that I do. To put it really simply, I find it really incredible to be able to listen to the places and to create work out of the places that I'm listening to, where you can actually hear the sounds of those places. And really importantly as well, people's voices. You know, I always find that putting voices into text, it does something to it, you know, and to be able to hear people's intonation, to be able to hear people's cadences, to be able to hear where they pause or where they kind of change their mind halfway, or, you know, all of the different ways that people communicate about things, you know, that you can hear in someone's voice, or the ways that an environment sounds, you know, there's so much information there, and there's so much richness there, you know, and I feel like that's also a really crucial part of getting some of this stuff that we're working with across, because you can talk about how something sounds, and you can hear how something sounds, and it's just a quite different aesthetic experience, I think. So, you know, I think to be doing this kind of work in conjunction with art making, and in conjunction with, you know, a creative output as well. I know Zoe was like, you've got to be an impoverished artist, and like, you know, but I think also, you know, this kind of stuff comes through in all of my creative practice as well. And I think they just very naturally go together. You know, the things that we're doing with the Institute for Freshwater Fish Futures also has a really strong focus on different kinds of ways of articulating our work, you know, like through Zoe's drawings, through animations, through sound works, you know, through different kind of creative practices. And I think to just kind of limit how we articulate what we're doing to just academic writing, it just, there's such a huge array of other ways to be working with material. And I think it's also really important, as Zoe said, it's, you know, neither of us are professional, you know, neither of us gone to art school, you know, all of it's kind of self-taught. And it's really important to be able to say to people like, yeah, you can do, if you want to express things in other ways, then express things in other ways. And I hope that answered your question.
And it's, I guess it's like an explicitly inclusive and exploratory space like that. We're not here to curate and sort of like gatekeep what art should look like, that it's really coming from a place of like that connectedness. Yeah.
I have a swirl of thoughts that I'm going to try and hope kind of cohere as a question that really have to do with building on what you were saying, Amer, about introducing voices into text and hearing their cadence and rhythm, and then thinking about what you were saying, Zoe, about the kind of like the inclusiveness of the work and inviting others into the work. And I'm thinking just about how that kind of deeply generous work, collaborative work, how it's hard to make it really legible. Like, who's the author, right? Who made this? Who's the artist? And both you've both spoken to this already, but I just wondered, you know, in terms of thinking about Western notions of authorship and you know, academic copyright and all kinds of things, like what kinds of practices do you use to kind of acknowledge the shared co-creation and the co-labor that goes into your works?
Yeah, for me personally, I make audio works with interviews, and when I make audio works with interviews, I tend to have someone, well, I can talk about one. It's a piece about deep seabed mining in Papua New Guinea, and the co-producer on that piece was one of the main campaigners in the anti-deep seabed mining campaign. You know, so we created that piece together. We did the interviews together. We made all the aesthetic decisions together. They're the co-producer, you know, and every single person that I did an interview with in there was all credited as, you know, co-authors of it. And that also means that everybody's paid. Every time I get a commission for that work, the money goes back to the people who are also in it because they're co-authors in it, you know. So in a very material sense, like, it means, as Zoe was saying at the beginning, redistribution of wealth, you know, redistribution of funding, making sure that everybody's named, that everybody is present every time that work gets exhibited somewhere or gets curated into something. I think also there is a really brilliant collective here in so-called Australia, a collective of Indigenous and non-Indigenous geographers, and well, also other people that are not geographers in other disciplines. And they always write as a co-author the country that they're working with. So specifically, they're working with Baraka country. And so Baraka country is always put as the first author. And I think that's just a really important practice, to just have it in their academic papers. You know, obviously, like, that's a method that they've worked with for quite a long time. And I don't know the specifics. I know there are a lot of professors involved in that, and I don't know the specifics about when they apply for grant funding, what they put in or how they kind of frame that. But I think just as an example, to see academics who are tenured, who are in, you know, stable positions where they can kind of push back against some of these things and to experiment with some of these things. They're just a really brilliant example of making that small shift where they're saying, we are always writing with country. You know, country is where we write from, country is who we write with, you know, and that is just consistently always stated in their work over and over again. It's stated in their talks, you know, it's just constantly brought in and made something that's very kind of, yeah, consistent. And I think, like, in a practical sense, even something like that, again, I wish I could say more about what that means for them in terms of funding and jobs and promotions and things, but I actually have absolutely no idea. But yeah, Zoe?
Oh gosh. Well, I mean, I'm feeling a pull to move away from writing articles, like peer-reviewed articles and journals. And more of my attention is being drawn into setting up, like at Carleton, we've set up an Indigenous Environmental Knowledge Institute that explicitly partners with this group called the Indigenous Culture and ICMI, which is run by an Algonquin person named Monique Minach, and we're using that as a way to sort of like bring Algonquin governance into the institution. And the goal is that eventually when I leave Carleton, that like that stays in Algonquin ownership. And rather than being something tied to me as the researcher, is actually tied to the land and the place and the people who govern that place. And so that's sort of something we're experimenting with at an institution that's not super open to it. It took 3 years to fight for the funding, and then we publicly shamed them in the national media and finally got the money they promised me. But yeah, I think that with that kind of stuff, like I'm becoming more interested in doing work that explicitly serves a purpose that an Indigenous nation has approached and asked for. And so also looking forward to partnerships with Métis communities where we're going to be doing similar kind of work with an explicit focus on redistribution of power and wealth. But working with Amer, like, you know, we write as co-authors, it's complicated, but trying to find ways to make sure that people are properly credited, and definitely pushing back against the idea that Indigenous people are only informants, which is such a common practice in the sciences and the humanities and social sciences still. And so a lot of our projects incorporate community partners as full partners, who are also named on the grants and have recourse to fundings and support. And for us, that's really important. So, yeah.
Thank you for that wonderful answer from both of you, and really thank you for this really exceptional question and answer session, really astute answers to really wonderful questions. Thanks to everyone at the conference for being here in this live session, and we look forward to seeing you at the few remaining live events that we have. Again, thank you, Amer, thank you, Zoe. It was really a treat to get to talk to you. Be well, take good care.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for the great questions and generosity.